Hi, this is Paul. Job sent me a little something from Reddit, which was pretty depressing. Basically, the topic was why are 20 and 30 somethings so depressed these days, and it's quite a read. Not a lot of surprising things in there. There's a lot of consternation about the amount of work that people are doing for not being able to get ahead. There's a sense of loss of community. There's there's a lot in the thread, and of course, it reminded me of the meaning crisis as it is framed. Ian McGilchrist and John Vervaeke have a conversation on the Theory of Everything channel with Kurt Jamungal, and John has what I think is a relatively short description of the meaning crisis here as he and Ian McGilchrist compare notes.
I think the very processes that make us intelligently adaptive make us perennially susceptible to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior.
Now I know that's not necessarily the easiest language to understand. I've been hearing John use these phrases for quite a while. I When I was in Canada, John and Christopher Mastropietro were there, and I asked them to consider doing a remake of the symptomology of the meaning crisis video, and they said that was a good idea as they're filming this next series that they're doing. They'll consider maybe adding one to, because the previous one that they did, which I thought was an excellent video, the sound quality wasn't very good, and so it would be good to redo it with better sound quality. It basically what John just said there was that in many ways you can say it. One way to say it would be, in many ways, the capacities that we possess set us up for this meaning crisis in some ways. One of the things that you'll hear me talk about both at Thunder Bay, and I talked about this at the Tom Holland event, was I often use Goliath, which is a massive alligator in an alligator farm in Florida that I visited with my family a number of years ago. And I saw this massive alligator sitting in this warm pool, basically all by itself. And I asked the caretaker, doesn't that massive alligator get bored? Nah, I just keep it in warm water and throw chicken at it. And Goliath is just fine. We, however, are not such creatures. And what do we need? Well, we actually need a lot. We need to be connected to a world, and I think the way that we most easily connect to that world is via a story, a much bigger story, because we find that participating in that is very meaningful. I'm going to let John finish what he was saying here.
And that across time and culture, people have come up with complex systems, because this is a very complex system. Ecologies of practices, I call them, for intervening and ameliorating that self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And also,
and now self-deceptive, self-destructive. There's not only do we have these global stories that we live within, but we are always testing these global stories that we live within. And one of the ways to think about the Enlightenment, and I know the Enlightenment gets a really hard time in some of these little circles, is when you look at someone like Voltaire and the philosophes, and even the new atheists, they're testing the story. They're saying, is this story deceptive? Does it hold water? But the self-destructive aspect is just as legitimate. If you destroy the stories that your civilization is dependent upon, well, then what will you have left?
so enhancing the sense of connectedness that is being undermined by the
There's a little pause.
self-destructive behavior. That's to oneself, to other people, to the world. And when you take a look at that sense of connectedness, it overlaps very much with what's called meaning in life. And as Ian said, we want to feel that we are connected to something that has a value and a reality other than our own egocentric preferences and existence.
Okay, you got to kind of slow that down. We want to be connected to something that is beyond our own egocentric focuses of existence. In other words, I might have a pleasant job, a job that I enjoy, but my job has to be connected to something bigger. I myself find my job very worthwhile and very meaningful and very fulfilling because it is in fact connected to something far bigger than I am.
So I'll often ask people, what do you mean by meaning in life? And I'll say, well, tell me what you would want to continue existing, even if you weren't here.
Now, pause right there, and that's a really good question. And John, if you sort of slow him down often, because he's got so used to talking about these things, he sort of rattles them off to get them all in because he wants to get all the words in. That simple question: if you weren't here, what still matters to you?
And they'll tell me, and I'll say, that's what matters to you. That's what you want to be connected to beyond your egocentric preferences and your egocentric existence.
And so I'm continuing to read this book on China at the beginning of the Second World War. In this book, there's a significant chapter on the rape of Nanking, which is a very famous episode in the war. And he does a fair amount of analysis about it. Why did this happen? Why did the Japanese soldiers act the way they acted? The whole book itself is rough. There are a lot of sad stories in this book and in this chapter. And you have basically at the beginning of the 20th century, China just trying to keep up with the changes that are happening in the world systems, and in many ways internally not being able to keep up with those changes. And so there's a revolution that tries to get to something more like the kinds of systems of government and systems of thought and systems that are connected with the rest of the world, but it doesn't, and it sort of falls into warlord factioning and Chiang Kai-shek keeps trying to sort of, and the Nationalist Party keeps trying to infuse nationalism into it to get them up to speed. But Japan at this point is really looking around for at least elements even within Japan, because Japan within itself is quite conflicted and divided. And so elements within Japan see the opportunity of sort of starting to feed off of China to get those natural resources that China doesn't have, and to sort of build a Chinese empire out of the dysfunctional parts of, or a Japanese empire out of the dysfunctional parts of China. But then you have this just destruction of a city, and the rape and the murders just go on, and often with an occupying army. The occupation army wants to, as quickly as possible, sort of assume control of the structures and bring a degree of order to the city. And that was true in parts of China, where in some places that the Japanese were occupying, they restored order, and so refugees actually went back, because the Japanese then would prop up those different systems that would allow life to sort of go on, and it might be a little bit better in a Japanese occupied zone rather than some of the other zones. But in Nanking, it was just bad for a very long time. News didn't get out, and there's all kinds of reasons for it in terms of the varying different levels of politics and what was going on with it. But a lot was made of the fact that the Japanese soldiers that went into that town were older conscripts. They were men in their 30s and 40s, and they didn't have sort of the youthful vision of imperial Japan in front of them, and they felt a little bit deceived and frustrated by the fact that, well, this was supposed to be sort of an easy cakewalk, and actually by this point in the war the Chinese were beginning to mount stiffer resistance to them, and they just go in and they just completely destroy the city. Now, if you swing back to the book that I read earlier this summer, Ian Toll's Twilight of the Gods, you get the view from Japan as well. Now, the entire Japanese nation was sort of primed for mobilizing everyone and getting everyone on the same page. And there was this actually a very moving chapter about the kinds of indoctrination that they did with children.
Even in the middle of the night. The director of Ueno Park Zoo ordered that lions, tigers, and other large predators be euthanized. lest an air raid destroy their enclosures and set them loose in the streets of Tokyo. Students drilled in their schoolyards. Younger children learned the routines by singing and clapping with their teachers. Air raid, here comes an air raid. Red, red, incendiary bomb. Run, run, get mattress and sand. Air raid, here comes an air raid. Black, black, here come the bombs. Cover your ears, close your eyes. Resentment grew as drills and inspections became more frequent and intrusive. Civil defense routines sapped people's energy at a time when many were not getting enough to eat. A disgusted Japanese woman said, "Running uphill with pails of water seemed to me a silly and tedious way to fight a war."
Now what's interesting here is, again, the adults with broader experiences have the capacity to question what's going on with the government, even if they don't have the civil liberty to do so.
Every third or fourth night, air raid sirens called them out of their futon beds to sit in dank, subterranean air raid shelters. The shelters, dug by civilians wielding picks and shovels, were cramped and poorly constructed, often without lighting or even seating. If there was any rain at all, they flooded. False alarms were common, and when the sirens and wooden clackers started up, people were inclined to pull a pillow over their heads and ignore them. Non-compliance spread even as the threat of air raids grew. In late 1943, the regime had begun promoting the idea that non-combatants and non-essential workers should evacuate the cities. Mass evacuation was a partial solution to the danger of air raids, but also a means to relieve pressures on mass transit and to ease the logistical problem of importing food from rural areas. The campaign began with public service messages.
The fuel was a serious problem for the Japanese.
Encouraging the very old, the very young, the pregnant, and the physically infirm, anyone who is not actively contributing to the war effort, to move in with their country cousins. According to the Cabinet Board of Information in an official statement of December 1943, urban evacuation does not mean only fleeing and dispersion from the city, but was a positive contribution toward strengthening our fighting power. Those working in munitions factories or other jobs deemed essential to the war effort were not permitted to go, unless entire factories were relocated, in which case workers were compelled to move with their employers and fellow employees. Special evacuation trains were run out of Tokyo, full of morose-looking urbanites carrying whatever worldly goods they could manage, and leaving everything else behind. Children were evacuated from cities on a voluntary basis beginning in early 1943. But in December 1943, the Japanese Ministry of Education stepped up pressure on urban schools and parents to send all primary school students to rural areas. On June 30, 1944, as the Americans invaded Saipan, the government announced the compulsory evacuation of 350,000 children from a dozen of the nation's largest cities. They were resettled in country inns, meeting halls, Buddhist monasteries, and abandoned resorts. As the B-29 raids began in November, entire schools left the cities under the supervision of their teachers, on trains bedecked with rising sun flags, while their parents bid goodbye from the platforms. Arriving at their destinations, the children were quartered in overcrowded dormitories, with 24-hour-a-day communal living and working arrangements. Allotted rations were often insufficient, and the children grew emaciated and malnourished. A teacher who accompanied her students from Tokyo to Nagano recalled, "It was pitiful to see the children lament when they took off the covers of their lunchboxes to find them only half full. To supplement their meager diet, they were sent out to forage for wild food, much of it barely edible. Weeds and bracken ferns, dandelion greens, bamboo shoots, bog rhubarb, persimmons, chickweed, mugwort, and dropwort. They hunted frogs and snakes to be skinned and roasted. They fished local streams for freshwater shrimp, carp, and loaches."
Now, what would be interesting is, and there's going to be a little bit more as the story continues to progress, the perspective of the children on this.
They ate grasshoppers, sparrows, snails, and beetles sautéed in oil. By the end of the war, according to a government medical report, evacuated children were consuming an average of 1,000 calories per day, far short of their minimal dietary requirements. The daily routines were strictly regimented, with classroom instruction and hours of hard physical labor. Students wore military uniforms and marched in ranks behind their teachers. Those of lower rank were required to salute their superiors, and all could be promoted or demoted according to their performance, attitude, personal bearing, and obedience to orders. They attended send-off ceremonies for departing servicemen and kamikaze pilots, sent letters and comfort packages to servicemen overseas, and greeted the returning ashes of fallen Japanese soldiers and sailors. As the war progressed, evacuated children spent less time in the classrooms and more contributing to the war effort. In September 1944, Prime Minister Koiso announced a total mobilization of the population. Facing this grave situation, we cannot permit even one idle person or one spectator within the country, regardless of age and sex. Every Japanese is a soldier. An edict issued by the regime ruled that work in the factories was equal to education. But by 1945, the factory managers were beset with absenteeism and demanded that their child workers spend more hours on the job. Children as young as 8 were put to work in munitions factories. Others were detached as farmhands to help harvest crops. In forested areas, legions of children went out to gather pine cones for the improbable purpose of converting pine oil to aviation fuel. By the end of the war, some 3.4 million students had been mobilized, and many were getting no more than an hour of traditional classroom study per day. We no longer had many classes at school, recalled Hideo Sato, an evacuated 6th grader in Ibaragi Prefecture. The main thing we did was dig an anti-tank ditch in the corner of the schoolyard. It was an onerous task, especially for children who did not have the strength to haul much earth. It took 3 days to hollow out a single foxhole deep enough so that when the teacher jumped in, it would be over his head. We were assigned the task in groups, and each group was responsible for completing theirs. In this isolated and confined rural environment, the children were told only what the Ministry of Education decreed that they should be told. Teachers were monitored for any sign of defeatism. In late 1944, a new national defense thought drive aimed to ensure that those entrusted
That's thought drive in quotation marks.
with the mission of education have resolved that they will firmly maintain a conviction of certain victory and devote themselves to bolstering the fighting spirit. Evacuated children were required to keep diaries, both to practice their writing skills and to record their innermost thoughts and feelings. The diaries were submitted to the teachers, who graded them based upon conventional measures of grammar, diction, calligraphy, and writing style, but also upon the sincerity and ardor of their sentiments. Mihoko Nakane, a 9-year-old girl whose entire primary school was evacuated from Tokyo to Toyama Prefecture in 1945, often expressed a wholehearted desire to learn, to improve, and to please her teachers. In her diary, she pledged to be a good child, or an even better good child, and to do her best to become a splendid citizen. Mihoko's enthusiasm was irrepressible, whether she was gathering firewood, completing a fun training march, foraging for wild mugwort, seeing off new army recruits, singing war songs, or honoring the spirits of returning war dead. It was a truly sad affair. I really feel grateful to them. She recorded her obligatory hostility toward the enemy. Hateful, hateful Americans and English. How hateful the Americans and English are. That's what I thought. Mihoko never complained about her meager rations, even when they were infested with weevils, and often recorded that her lunch or dinner was really delicious. When she was promoted to the rank of squad leader, she was mindful of her grave duty. Because of this, I want all the more to be a good child and to act like a squad leader.
I've been watching some of the Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix, and when he's sitting with his grandmother and she pulls out a box of all the pictures of her son, when Jeffrey Dahmer's father, when he was a boy, and I just really want to be a good boy, Jeffrey Dahmer says, but seemingly didn't get a chance to tell much of his story to anyone about just how monstrous his desires and his life was becoming.
Innocent, trusting, and adaptable by nature, children tended to maintain their zeal for the war even as their parents and teachers grew disillusioned. They did not expect to eat well, because they could not remember a time when they had not been hungry. They did not mind working in munitions plants because the experience was a novelty and provided a relief from tedious classroom routines. Producing weapons for the war effort made them feel important. Gathering pine cones for aviation fuel gave them the sense that they were personally helping to lift the Japanese warplanes that flew overhead. Those who worked in the balloon bomb factories were told enthralling stories of how their creations would soar around the earth to smite the demonic Americans. They enjoyed the pageantry of the war, the singing and marching, the invitation to trample and spit on American and British flags, the monthly reading of the Imperial Rescript on Education, and the group calisthenics each morning, when they all stripped to the waist, girls included, and chanted, "Annihilate America and England, 1, 2, 3, 4. Annihilate America and England, 1, 2, 3, 4. They were the last to suspect that the glorious victories reported on the radio were fabrications. I was born in war. Hideo Sato explained in an oral history recorded half a century later. Boys like war. War can become the material for play. It almost becomes a sport. It's just an extension of naughty games they all play anyway. He was 11 years old when his class was evacuated to Ibaragi Prefecture. They were put to work on an airfield that was repeatedly attacked by American carrier planes. Hideo and his classmates were thrilled whenever the Hellcats and Corsairs arrived, and tried to prove their courage by standing erect without flinching for as long as they could stand it.
You can just imagine these little boys playing this game, can't you?
If you were watching, you might be able to roll away and escape at the last moment. The plane comes in low, a cannon on each wing, right towards you at enormous speed, but still it takes time. You can tell if they're aiming at you. Then you see sparks fly. The sound comes afterwards. You learn to judge from experience the angle of the sparks. When they flash at 45 degrees, they're most dangerous. Then you close your eyes instinctively. They often called it strafing, but it wasn't with machine guns. They were machine cannons, 20 millimeters, and they had explosives in each shell. It wasn't like in the movies when you see those little puffs of smoke. Across the rice paddies, the dirt flew up, and at the roots, sparks shot up, and explosions went off. Boom, 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 boom. The instant you knew they'd missed, you'd stand up and start running. They were so low that the pilot sometimes opened his cockpit window and leaned out. American pilots looking out at us, wearing airplane goggles. I even waved at them. This happened to me more than 10 times. In line with Prime Minister Koiso's national policy to arm the 100 million, evacuated children were trained in hand-to-hand combat so that they could do their part in the looming battle for the homeland. Mihoko Nakane, the 9-year-old evacuee in Toyama, described this spiritual training with her usual brio. It was lots and lots of fun. Her class trained with spears, wooden swords, and mock grenades. The drills were interspersed with their ordinary recreational routines, such as dodgeball, piggyback rides, war songs, and scavenger hunts. The children stripped to their underwear and put on rising sun headbands. In a hand grenade throwing class, they threw small balls at a large ball, which was said to represent an enemy soldier's head. Then they trained with wooden swords. We faked to the left and faked to the right. While Mihoko practiced thrusting with a bamboo spear, her teacher shouted, "Spear them, spear them." Later she told her diary, "It was really fun. I was tired, but I realized that even one person can kill a lot of the enemy."
Now, what's interesting is when you get to the end of the book, when the people begin to understand what the larger reality was looking like. This was the announcement made by the emperor to the people and the reaction to it.
The NHK transmitted dead air, punctuated occasionally by solemn announcements confirming that the special broadcast would begin at noon. At 11:59 a.m., air raid sirens churned briefly and then fell silent. The audiences listened with breathless intensity. The streets fell dead silent. In many places, the summer cicadas warbled loudly, and people cocked their heads to hear. At the NHK studios in Tokyo, a technician dropped the needle on the phonograph and then stood and bowed his head. A voice came across the airwaves. It was faint, reedy, and tremulous. Many found it difficult to follow amid a hiss of static. It began, "To our good and loyal subjects." After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. The language was archaic, an obscure dialect of the ancient Japanese imperial court. Even highly educated Japanese found the speech cryptic and perplexing. Those who had received less schooling were completely baffled. Akio Morita, a young Navy lieutenant and future co-founder of the Sony Corporation, found the language difficult to comprehend. But he knew it was the Emperor as soon as he heard the voice. And even though we couldn't follow the words exactly, we knew what the message was, what he was telling us, and we were frightened and yet relieved. To Naval Aviator Takeshi Maeda, it seemed like the cicadas stopped making noise momentarily. The Emperor continued. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of the military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The phrase, "not necessarily to Japan's advantage," has been lampooned as an understatement. A previous draft had more accurately stated that the war situation went daily from bad to worse. The Army Ministry had insisted on softening that language. The point had been debated at length by the Cabinet on the afternoon of August 14th. Even in the throes of defeat, the Army was determined to take some of the sting out of its humiliation. In the United States and Allied nations, where translations of the message were published the following day, many were angered by a tone they regarded as self-righteous and even defiant. Hirohito had suggested that Japan's motives in waging war had been pure and just, for self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, and that it had never been Japan's purpose to infringe on the sovereignty of other nations or to embark on territorial aggrandizement. In the Emperor's telling, his decision to surrender was a gallant gesture of self-abnegation and altruism.
Now, of course, China and Korea are going to greatly differ on that point, as will the Philippines.
At the conclusion of the broadcast, many Japanese were dumbstruck and tearful. They bowed deeply to their neighbors, then returned wordlessly to their homes. A few gathered and whispered to one another. Those who had understood more of the archaic dialect translated for their neighbors. In private musings, in conversations, or in diary entries, many Japanese expressed deep concern for the Emperor's feelings. They felt collectively responsible for having caused him sorrow and anxiety. Many were moved by the clear indication of His Majesty's compassion. Navy Maintenance Officer Hachiro Miyashita found that he could not eat, could not speak, and could not concentrate on his work. He passed the day in a catatonic stupor. Elsewhere, there were outbursts of anger. One man said that he and his neighbors felt the horror of being defeated, but even worse, they shared the inexpressible horror of being the citizens of a defeated country.
And part of what makes this so amazing is the collective nature of their communion and their experience.
A fifth grader who had been evacuated to the country made the mistake of telling his classmates, "Now that the war is over, we'll be able to go home." Several other boys set upon him and beat him, shouting, "You traitor! We swore we would do all we could here until the day of victory." Parents who had lost sons in the war were furious that their sacrifice had been rendered meaningless. If ending the war was so easy, if the Emperor wielded the power to simply call it off, why hadn't he acted earlier? "Your Majesty," one said, "because of this my sons have all died in vain. A dog's death." Dr. Michihiko Hachiya in Hiroshima had been working for 9 consecutive days to care for those injured by the atomic bomb. After listening to the Emperor's broadcast, many of the patients in his ward burst out in anger. They shouted, "How can we lose the war? Only a coward would back out now. I would rather die than be defeated. What have we been suffering for? Those who died can't go to heaven in peace now."
Now, again, it's amazing. Part of Peterson's point often is the point about meaning and suffering. And you look at the immense amount of suffering, but the meaning that nationalism and pride in their nation had given them with respect to all of the sufferings that they were undergoing.
Dr. Hachiya noted that many who had expressed defeatist sentiments after the bombing now demanded that the fight should go on, as if they could not make sense of their terrible burns and the loss of loved ones, unless the entire nation immolated itself in a final battle. The one word, surrender, had produced a greater shock than the bombing of our city, the doctor wrote in his diary. The more I thought, the more wretched and miserable I became. But the Emperor had expressed his will, and there was no opposing him. Most public anger was turned against the government and the military leadership. Some decried the leaders who had prevailed upon the Emperor to surrender. Others condemned the same leaders for having plunged Japan into a reckless and catastrophic war. Many were fearful, assuming that they were to be enslaved by the Allied victors. Shaking their heads, they simply repeated the inconceivable fact again and again in a daze. "We've been defeated." And they asked one another with wide eyes, "Now that we have been defeated, what will happen?" No one knew, but it was easy to imagine the worst, especially for those who had some inkling of how Japanese forces had behaved in China, Malaya, the Philippines, and elsewhere. Yet many others felt a dawning sense of relief. The air raids would finally end. They would not have to fight off an invading barbarian army with kitchen cleavers and bamboo spears. Perhaps the government would reopen the bathhouses, and they could all wash off the accumulated filth. Even on the night of August 15th, the first night of the peace, air raid regulations were relaxed and electric lights were left on after dark. People took down their blackout shades. Hisako Yoshizawa, a secretary living in Tokyo, wondered how her neighbors were taking the momentous news, and concluded that an unmistakable brightness in their faces told the story. On military bases, discipline broke down. Soldiers refused to take orders. Young hotheads vowed, "We'll behead the evil subordinates of the emperor." Those posted overseas felt a keen desire to get home, to protect their families against the incoming army of occupation. They planned to desert the military as soon as they reached Japanese soil. Enlisted men who had been physically abused by their officers took the opportunity to exact revenge. One soldier who had expressed defeatist sentiments recalled, "I cheered that I had been right, and I was hit by an officer. I hit him back." A nurse at an army hospital in Tochigi Prefecture watched several officers crying, forgive me," while being beaten by their own men.
Notice how many different ways this whole thing goes.
In a calmer frame of mind, Japanese servicemen considered whether it was their duty to kill themselves. Many did not relish the thought of returning home in defeat after so many others had given their lives. They did not expect to be greeted warmly by their neighbors, perhaps not even by their families, because they would be bearing the dishonor of defeat. Shoji Tsuchida, a kamikaze pilot stationed at Tachiarai Air Base, had expected to fly his last mission on the same day as the Emperor's broadcast. He wrote in his diary, "I feel the evanescence of the fate of defeat. The eyes of locals seem to be appealing to us for something, but the truth is that we have been stained with the stigma of defeat." At Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, officers were divided over whether or not they should comply with the surrender order, launch a guerrilla resistance movement in the mountains, or kill themselves. Many vowed to fight or die by their own hands. But one young lieutenant remarked, "Dying is the easier thing to do. Consider living under the ugly enemy. It will be harrowing and painful. It will not be easy to live through the Dark Ages and to transmit our culture to the next age. But if this is not done, there will not be an age when the Japanese people are truly awakened."
Now again, pay attention to the connection to the much bigger world through the lens that they have.
Some who had given up all hope of surviving the war now realized with a surge of elation that they had been granted a second life. The Emperor's statement had clearly absolved them of responsibility for the nation's defeat, and had summoned them to the work of rebuilding a peaceful Japan. To defy surrender would dishonor his will and subvert his authority. The rescript had included this stern injunction, an echo of Meiji's imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. "Beware most strictly of any outbursts of emotion that may engender needless complications, and of any fraternal contention and strife that may create confusion, lead you astray, and cause you to lose the confidence of the world." In the end, with surprisingly few exceptions, the great majority of Japanese officers and enlisted men of all ranks chose to live. "I thought of committing suicide but was unable to go through with it," a soldier in southern Kyushu later admitted. "I'll be reborn 7 times and attack America, I vowed. With this, I permitted myself to continue living." General Anami was one of the exceptions. He did not hear Hirohito's broadcast. He spared himself that mortification by taking the samurai's way out in the early morning hours of August 15th. He had been up all night, drinking sake and entertaining visitors, refusing to give any support to the attempted military coup d'etat that was unfolding at the Imperial Palace. At dawn, the well-sodden general composed his traditional poem upon departing the world. With a few brushstrokes, Anami kept it simple. "Not even a half word to be left behind, for benevolence has been bestowed upon me by His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor." Then he plunged a short steel blade into his own abdomen up to the hilt, and carved through his viscera left to right. The blade severed the descending aorta, causing massive hemorrhaging into the abdominal cavity. He died slowly, painfully, and in the traditional Japanese view, honorably. One night later, Admiral Onishi performed the same gory ritual, thrusting the knife into his belly and carving out his own bowels. Many officers came to visit him in his death throes, but he refused their offers to put him out of his misery. It took him 15 hours to bleed out. Lying in a pool of his own blood, this most warlike of hardliners told the young officers who visited him that they must obey the Emperor and follow his instructions to strive for the peace of the world. General Shizuichi Tanaka, who had played a crucial role in putting down the August 14th to 15th rebellion, shot himself on August 24th, the day the first advanced detachments of U.S. occupiers set foot on Japanese soil. General Hajime Sugiyama, who had preceded Anami as army minister, shot himself on September 12th. His wife Keiko killed herself a day later. General Tojo, the little Mussolini who had led his nation into a disastrous war, tried and failed to take his own life on September 11, 1945. As U.S. troops knocked on his front door intending to arrest him as a war criminal, Tojo peeked out of a second-story window. Realizing that he was cornered, he retreated into his study and shot himself in the chest. The wound was serious but not mortal. His captors rushed him to a hospital where surgeons sewed up the wound and replaced his lost blood through an intravenous feed. The failed suicide was considered by Tojo's countrymen as the crowning ignominy of his odious career. He made a full recovery, only to be convicted of war crimes and hanged in 1948.
The New York Times has a piece on the texts now. Putin is a fool. Intercepted calls reveal Russian army in disarray. If the war doesn't seem to connect up with a bigger purpose, with a good purpose, with something at the top, it destroys the body from below. Here's a little bit more from the Jordan Peterson, Peter Kreeft conversation.
Yeah. William James, one of my favorite philosophers, has this reflection on a utopian community at Chautauqua, New York, which he visited for a week, and he was fascinated. Everything was perfect. There were no cops. Everything was free. The culture was wonderful. And when he got back to New York City with all the garbage and all the gunfire, he said, now I'm in the real world. This is what I was missing there. We're not made for Disney World, for Disneyland.
No, there's something treacly and sentimental. It's like Pleasure Island in the Pinocchio story, right? There's this overlay of hedonic gratification, but underneath that, there's a kind of dark slavery. That's exactly what happens in that movie, is Pinocchio, when he's striving to become a real boy, he's enticed by a hedonic vision. And he goes to Pleasure Island, where you can have whatever you want, whenever you want, but it's ruled by someone who wants to turn everybody who's there into a voiceless, braying slave.
One of the most surprising books I ever read is called City of Joy. They made a very trashy movie out of it, but it's a great book. It's by the same journalist, Dominique Lapierre, who wrote Is Paris Burning? And it's about Calcutta, especially about the lepers in Calcutta, who are about the most miserable people in the most miserable place on earth. And the title of the book is quite accurate. He found a lot of joy among this lowest of the lowest class in Calcutta, simply because they loved each other. They sacrificed for each other. The sense of community that was there, it didn't take away the pain, but it added a meaning to the pain that made it preferable to the pleasures of the upper class. It was convincing because he was there in detail. It sounds romantic and impossible and ridiculous, and yet it's true. The poor are happier than the rich. Look, what's the poorest continent in the world? Africa. Who smiles the most? Africans. What's the richest subcontinent in the world? Scandinavia. Who commits suicide the most? Scandinavians.
Well, you see, too, that often people who are tried by fire discover the deepest association with meaning precisely under those conditions. And that is analogous to the vision of the crucifix, let's say, that you have to go deep into the darkness, and perhaps, hopefully, voluntarily, before you can see the brightest of all possible lights. And so this idea that, part of the problem is, if you provide your children with everything, which you could do as a wealthy parent, let's say, you deprive them of deprivation, you deprive them of adventure, you deprive them of destiny, and you remove from them the necessity of grappling in a manner that really does make life meaningful. One of the things that I've really noticed in my tours, this has been extremely interesting and heartening, is that whenever I talk about the nexus between responsibility and meaning, the audiences always go dead silent. They're pretty silent during most of the discussions, but that particularly brings a hush to everyone because it's not a message that people are receiving anymore. It's like, okay, life is suffering and malevolence in its essence, in some undeniable sense. It may not be only that, but it is undeniably also that. And so you need a sustaining meaning to tide you over while you're suffering and while you're betrayed. And then the question is, well, where's the most reliable place to find that meaning? And one answer is, well, hedonism, and another answer might be cynicism and anarchism and that sort of wild life that goes along with throwing off all constraints. And there's some attraction to that. But more fundamentally, if you watch how people actually respond in times of crisis, they find that the responsibilities that they've undertaken in the past to form friendships, to form intimate relationships, to clean up their family and establish tight bonds, to take on some major burden and make sacrifices in their life, that's where they get all the meaning. And I can't believe that we don't teach young people this now. We don't teach them this at all. And it's such a catastrophe. And you've taught young people now for a very long time.
And the rest goes. But the point here, again, it's the point he's made often, is that, Vervaeke's making a similar point. The meaning is sort of between us and the world, and that's where the meaning is. But that had better go all the way up and all the way down. We, in a sense, we live in sort of the moderate connectedness of it. We feel it. Earlier they talked about bringing the stones to the cathedral. When I was in the last day I was in the UK. Our host from our southern meeting took us to Stonehenge, which was an absolute delight. It's, you see this thing, and so it's fun to see there. But what was really amazing about the whole area was that there's way more going on there than just Stonehenge itself, and trying to piece together the entire story that goes about there. And one of the amazing things is just how far those stones, these enormous stones, before you have, any of this non-human or animal muscle to move these enormous stones, just how far they took those stones from someplace way on the coast of Wales all the way over to where Stonehenge is today. And I'm not going to tell you the names of the people, but if they want to out themselves in the comment section, they're certainly welcome to. But my guide said, a lot of these storytellers try to say that, oh, this must have been slave labor that they had used to move these stones, which the idea is quite telling on our part, because we're sort of project ourselves back and think, well, that's how we would move it. And he said it's probably something much similar to, let's say, something that Peterson and Kreeft were talking about in terms of the stone, the stone masons who were putting together cathedrals that would take hundreds of years. It's probably a part of a deeply religious, it was probably an honor to accompany the stones all the way to this site and raise them as such. It was probably a deeply meaningful religious ritual that people would see as an incredibly meaningful and important thing that would be their whole life. Now I'm told that the videos from the Thunder Bay event might be available as soon as this weekend, so some of those should be coming out. I don't know how Jonathan and John are planning on releasing them on their own channels. I'll probably won't release them all at once, just because that's sort of a lot, and probably just pace it out as time goes. If you release videos on YouTube, you recognize that if you put sort of a whole glut out there, people don't absorb the glut. That if you really want sort of the videos to be digested, release them bit by bit, and then people will sort of take them in as they come. And that's something that the streaming services are looking at. But I preached, and I didn't preach last week again because I was out because of COVID. But Paul is setting up in the book of 1 Corinthians this comparison between the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God. And so I'll have to preach chapter 3 this week. Brothers and sisters, I do not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I give you milk, not solid food, for you are not ready, or you're not ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. Now, what does he mean by that? He means by the bickering and the feuding that they're doing amongst themselves, the one-upmanship in order to rise above each other in these status games, instead of looking to the overall project, which in the language of 1 Corinthians 3 is the construction of the temple of God. But that's not a construction of the temple of God out of stones. You very much have the image here that what Paul sees his participation in and his labor for is this building of a metaphorical temple, which is actually a human community that goes on through ages and ages. After all, what after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you come to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each this task. I placed the seed, Apollo watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be rewarded according to their own labor. We are co-workers in God's service, for we are God's field, God's building. By the grace God has given us, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone who is built, someone else is built on. But each one should build with care. No one can lay a foundation other than the one already laid, which is Christ Jesus. If one builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day, capital D in the NIV, which basically, again, is this apocalyptic day of, it's the day of the Lord, which I speak about quite a bit. Will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each person's work. If what has been built survives, the builder will receive a reward. If it is burned up, the builder will suffer loss, but yet will be saved, even though only one as escaping through the flames. Do you not know that you yourselves are God's temple? In other words, the whole community, and that God dwells in your midst. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you thinks they are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools, so that you may become wise, for the wisdom of this world is foolish, is in God's sight. Someone wrote me a note today about abuse of power, and that's always an issue in the church, and suggested that I talk more about it. What Paul lays out here is an ongoing intergenerational, across the world, over time perspective on how we act and what we build. And Paul says that is the measure. And you see this, it lays itself out in the world in different ways. If you want to build something that lasts, build it beautiful. Why? Because then future centuries will see the value in it and preserve it. But at the same time, that goes with a community. And it's all of the goodness that is in between people in the community that will make it last. Now, part of what's amazing at the end of that book, the Twilight of the Gods, the last of the 3 books on the Imperial Japanese Empire, is that there was a lot of goodness in the Japanese people that had been abused for the sake of the war effort by the government. And that had been exposed, and that entire project of Imperial Japan had been taken down and hated. Yet much of the goodness in the people and between the people was seen in the time after the war, where they could come together and they could weigh and evaluate the previous regimes that had sort of held sway over them. And in that way, you find that, in fact, goodness in the end will win, because evil in itself will always brings its own demise. It always requires goodness, even for its own stability, for its own preservation. And if that goodness doesn't go all the way up or all the way down to the foundations, it gets exposed at some point and it's torn down. And for this reason, one should have hope. But this is again, I think, part of the meaning crisis that those that Reddit those Reddit pieces were showing. You can derive a degree of meaning by going to work and doing a good job and being praised by your boss and winning the esteem of your coworkers because you're doing a good job. But we want the system to go out towards infinity in all directions, as it were. And I think that's exactly where God comes in. You want it to have a degree of eternality to it, that it doesn't just go away. And generally speaking, the more we go into it and the further it goes, if the meaning system doesn't have at least a degree of eternality, it is less satisfying than those systems that do. Now, as John Vervaeke noted, it's exactly these kinds of things that can lead us into self-deception. You can be sold a bill of goods, you can be fooled, but part of what we always do is we continue to test those systems, and we test them both in terms of the dead reckoning proximal way around me, and then as we continue to sort of move out, usually imaginatively and via narrative, to as far as the story can go in terms of the systems that afford us sight as they get beyond. And I think for that reason, people look at this meaning crisis among the young and despair. But I think this is part of the process where, in fact, what we're seeing happening is that many people in their 20s to 30s to 40s are, in fact, reaching out and are, in fact, looking for bigger answers and bigger solutions. Now, will some be deceived? Will some not be able to get there? Sure, that always happens. But it's the point is to help each other out, to share what you have with another. And as the process continues, hopefully we know the true and the good and the beautiful the further out we go. So I wanted to get some of that material from the Second World War in to just show just how deep meaning is in the systems around it, and the fact that it simply has to go to the extreme or we're not finally satisfied. And it's for this reason that I don't think religion will ever go away, because at some point we simply won't be satisfied with answers that don't go far enough. As the book of Ecclesiastes says, God has placed eternity in our hearts, and as Augustine said, our hearts aren't satisfied until they're satisfied in thee. And what Augustine meant by that was God. Again, I don't remember if it's the Daily Wire section or the other section of Peterson's talk with Peter Kreeft, but Kreeft talks nicely about the fact that at Boston College he teaches courses, and well, how do you find students? They're hungry. What are they hungry for? And Kreeft says, I have them read Boethius. I have them read Augustine. I have them read the great books in the world, because what they find in there is that they begin to get a sense that, oh, here I can find something that will satisfy my appetite for everything, that appetite for that eternity that is in my heart and desires to be satisfied. And I think that's what drives people to this little corner of the internet, and that's what drives people to want to talk and participate in this, and that's what drives people to continue to ask hard questions fearlessly of the world beyond us, and to want to know the truth, and that this in fact is a quest, and this in fact is a journey that one can fill their life with, and in fact is a journey that goes beyond even our own individual lives. So let me know what you think. Leave a comment.